of Omniu Presents the H3O Art of Life show. And that music was composed and performed by my godson, Kwame Steve Cobb of Kabbalah Records, along with his beautiful wife, Javanduka. And they will be having Kwanzaa at Olive Harvey College. You can call Olive Harvey College and find out the exact date. I don't want to give any misinformation out. And you can have a lot more of that music at their Kwanzaa celebration. And now we have to talk about the other side of the stories. And we have somebody here who is a marvelous storyteller. His name is Pemon Rami.
Thank you for having me on again.
I'm so glad to have you here because, for one thing, you have been consistent over all these years. You know, in part, you're here because you're a CHA alumni, and we were recently honored by Windows of Opportunity, and we both received one of these awards that was made
Beautiful.
by Deborah Hand, and you did say that this was one award that you would be keeping
Most certainly.
And displaying, as opposed to other awards that are of lesser fame, because Deborah Hand is a renowned sculptor with work in the Smithsonian Institute.
Most certainly.
So I'm happy that you're here, not just because you're a CHA alumni from Stateway Gardens, but I like the story, your story that you told when we were at this event, and you told about Okoro Harold Johnson, who is not here because of illness. And I wanted you to repeat that, you know, how someone gave you the opportunity or provided you with the incentive that became your life's work.
Most certainly. Well, first of all, when I talked about the awards, I've received a lot of plaques and awards throughout my career. And a piece of art is something that you can relish. And she's such a fine designer that I have it in a very, very prominent place. And one of the things that I said at the dinner is that it's more attractive than the Oscar. And it really is. I like it a lot more. Stateway Gardens. When I grew up there, it was a place that replaced a lot of the slums where black people lived in the city. And we lived at 56 in Prairie originally in a slum building. And I remember when my brother, who was 5 years old, was in his crib, he was attacked by a rat. And right after that, we moved. And we moved to the projects, which were beautiful. Manicured lawns, very, very warm. It had all of the kitchen appliances and so forth. But more than anything, it was a center for families and men. There were a lot of men in my life there. And my father was a baseball coach, and that protected me from all of the other young men in the community because everybody knew my father, and he was like a male mentor to a number of young men. But at the same time, there was a lot of men. There were families there. And I think that the change that came to the projects was when they changed the rules and families could no longer live there. And it had, I think, a devastating effect because the men that were allowed to come in had to hide whenever the inspectors came by to determine who was living in the place. But Okoro, when I was 9 years old, I was playing Little League Baseball. And I took some equipment back after a baseball game to the Park District, and I saw Okoro, a fellow named James Hughes, who I'll never forget, and Abinah Brown on stage performing Langston Hughes' material. And they were doing some skits of Langston, and I sat there fascinated watching them. And Okoro asked me that I want to become involved. At the time, I couldn't, but I remembered that incident, and then I ultimately was taken under the wing of Theodore Ward, who was one of the founders of the Negro Federal Theater with Langston Hughes and Richard Wright, and Ted took me under his wing when I was 15. And then I went back to Stateway and I produced my first musical under the tutelage of Okoro. And those men were in my life. And then in 1967, I saw a production when I was at Wendell Phillips High School of Lyrics of Sunshine and Shadows, which was a production that was produced by Oscar Brown Jr. and the music was done by Phil Coran. And it was the Spencer Jackson family were also performing in this play. And I sat there fascinated by this production. It was the first production to ever tour through Chicago schools. And I had the opportunity to see it, and it changed my life. it inspired me to say that that's what I was going to do. So at 16, I produced my first show. I got a job washing pots down at Montgomery Ward's, and I took the money and I bought costumes and I rented a theater and I wrote my show and I started putting it on. And two people that were in the first show that I produced was Shaka Khan. It was the first show she had ever done, and she ended up forming the group Shades of Black, and that title was taken from the name of my show, which was called Shades of Black Beauty. The other person that was in the show with me was Alio Talbot. It was the very first show
Mm-hmm.
he had ever done,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
he went on to form Montu
Mm-hmm.
after he did the show with us.
Mm-hmm.
But also, Douglas Allen Mann, the founder of the Chicago Theater Company, did his first show with me. Of course, my now wife, Masekwa, was in the show. There were a number of people that worked with us in the early 60s, and I should say late 60s and early 70s, that went on to do some really, really good work. And I was very young at the time. So when I started my theater company, I was 16, 15, 16 years old.
I I used to like to do those kinds of things, but I would not have known the nuts and bolts part. Like you said, you rented a theater, you worked, you saved your money, you bought some costumes. I'm sure you had rehearsals,
So certainly,
right? And then you gather together an audience.
so certainly. I taught theater every Tuesdays and Thursdays, from 1968 until around 1972, to a group of 20, 30 people that I had under my tutelage. And I would teach theater. I taught acting every week. And Theodore Ward, when I started working with him, he told me that if I was going to be in theater, that I needed to learn the theater in the theater. But I needed to go to school to learn everything else. I needed to learn the technical aspects. I needed to learn business. I needed to learn production, the technical aspects, all of those things. But I needed to learn the acting and the directing in the theater, which is what I did. So I started producing shows, and by the time I was 27, I had produced well over 30 productions and had done things around the nation. Went to New York when I was 17, and this is a fascinating story. I go to New York in 1968, so I was 18. I go to New York, and the reason that I went to New York is because I had done a play called A Son Come Home. And there was a line in A Son Come Home that said, 2 hours down the Jersey Turnpike. The trip beginning at the New York Port Authority terminal and straight down through New Jersey to Philadelphia and home. Just imagine, A Son's Come Home. So I said, oh, okay, well, from Philadelphia, it's only 2 hours down the Jersey Turnpike. So I went to Philly to visit my sister, and then I got on the bus, this 2 hour bus ride to New York. I was 18, had a little money in my pocket, didn't know anybody in New York. I get off the bus at Grand Central Station. I walk up and I look up at the skyscrapers. And I said, wow, I'm in New York. I look down and I see Muhammad Ali, Oscar Brown Jr., and an actor named David McKnight that I knew from Chicago. They were doing Big Time Buck White on Broadway when
Mm.
Muhammad had gotten kicked out of his fighting. And I hung out with them for 2 weeks backstage on Broadway. I stayed in Muhammad's suite one night. I hung out with Oscar. I had a wonderful time, my first experience in New York. And I had a chance to stay with them and be on Broadway.
How fortunate were you?
I was fortunate. It was just great. It was fate. It was meant to be. And then from that point on, every time I would travel someplace, I would go to Atlanta and Oscar would be there. I would go to New York and I'd be in Greenwich Village and I would bump into Oscar. I saw the first performance that Maggie Brown had ever done with him. The first time she sang on stage, I just happened to be in New York. I would, every place I was, Oscar would always be there, and we ended up becoming very, very good friends.
Talk to me about Oscar Brown Jr. because I admire him immensely, have always.
Oscar was talented beyond his time, and there are those of us that want to be accepted, and we strive daily to make our existence acceptable to the broader society. And then there's those of us that are committed to what is socially right. And Oscar was one of these people that raised a voice creatively that he wanted to touch people and he wanted to change people's lives. Now, as a result of that, he was overlooked and often chastised for the political side of what he was creating. But Oscar was as great as Shakespeare. When you read his works, when you look at the things that he's done, Oscar wrote poems and songs and plays completely in rhyme and in verse. Some of his plays are still, I think, the greatest pieces of work that have never been produced. As a songwriter, he was the original rapper. His works, from The Snake to The Lone Ranger to, he has a play called, and I happen to have read most of Oscar's work. He has a play called A Journey to Forever, which is about getting old. That is a exceptional, exceptional piece. He had talked to me about producing it right before he died. He had asked me would I help him to produce it, and I'm sorry that I never got a chance to do that with him. But Oscar was absolutely amazing, and one of the things that he talked to me about at length was his concept of what was called a dome, which he called a dramatic organization of musical expression. It was taking a creative art of music and forming it into a structure that didn't require a book, but it told a story. And a lot of the work that I ended up doing was based on that concept of a dome. That's what A Misbehavin' is. A lot of the musicals that were done in New York were based around that. If people saw Beyonce's work on Carmen that was done on HBO, that's a dome. Even though people are now calling them hip operas and things like that, it's all based around what Oscar put out into the world before anybody. One of the other things that Oscar said was he was more interested in his work being heard than he was with making money. And that's kind of how he was. So he didn't protect it. He put it out into the universe because he said he wrote 500 songs for people to hear them, not to sit in his closet and collect dust. He was brilliant.
It was amazing that not only could he write all of these songs and perform all of these songs, but he remembered the lyrics to all of these songs. Every time I ever saw him perform anywhere, he always had a different repertoire, and he always performed all of the music flawlessly.
That's
And
right.
I mean, just to remember all that is just amazing. If you didn't write it, to remember it all.
It was amazing. And he was writing until the end. He wrote a series of songs about the internet that are just fabulous. I had spent some time with him the summer before he passed, and he played all of these songs that he had written that was based around the incursion of the internet into our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was a fabulous piece. Oscar was, there would never be anyone else like him.
I believe that.
He set some standards that we need to go back. And I think at some point, people and historians will recognize him for how great he was
Mm-hmm.
when they get a chance to look at the breadth of the work that he produced. And it's a lot of it. It's tons of it.
And I've had, conversations with people talking about the violence among our youth and all of the things, that are wrong with the youth, and how we need culture and how we need consciousness and how they need music. And I said, wait a minute. We have it. We have music. We have culture. We just can't distribute it. We cannot get it to our own young people. Phil Coran is, you mentioned in your conversation, is another icon who, I mean, our geniuses have written the music. It's all there.
Most certainly. And there's some young people now that are still writing and producing positive works, but they can't get it played. And one of the things that someone told me recently, a young person said, well, part of the reason why people don't play it is because it's message music. And my comment to them was, all music has messages. When it's criticized is when it has a positive message.
Mm-hmm.
But most of the music that's on now is just negative, but
Mm-hmm.
it has a message to
Mm-hmm.
it. We have a responsibility to look at ourselves in a way that we take control of the morals of what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to get back to a sense of morality and to a sense of the fact that life is important and it needs to be treasured. We're currently producing a documentary, and it's called 19 in a Day. It takes place in the Pilsen district, and it's about a young Mexican-American boy who was killed the day after his 19th birthday. And it's a case of mistaken identity where a young man was he was seeking revenge, and he thought that it was the people that had shot his father, and it was the wrong car. But over 290 people have been shot in Chicago. 43 young people were killed last year that are teenagers. We interviewed a woman who's the head of a funeral home that has buried 225 teenagers. We have to take control of our lives again and of our communities. And it starts with people believing that life is important. It starts with us reconnecting to a spiritual side. And I'm not necessarily saying that people have to go to church, but what we do have to recognize is the fact that life is important. And there's so many things that are facing us. There's so many things that faces young people. We have a group of 30 teens that we've been mentoring recently. My wife Maseko and I mentor 90 kids a year that we take in and we mentor and we train. In the last month and a half, out of the 30 young people that we mentor, 9 of them have lost somebody very, very close to them that are young. We're not supposed to be telling those kind of stories. They're not supposed to be in a position where they're going to 3 or 4 funerals a week. It's not supposed to be that way. But the challenge is for all of us to recognize it. I called a young man who's a very good writer. He's an Emmy Award-winning music writer in Canada. And I called him a few weeks ago and I said, you know, you should commit yourself to writing a song, an anti-violence song, because your voice on that level has to be heard. We have to get celebrities and people that are the creative force in this world to stand up and participate in countering the information that we're getting. We have to. And there's a writer here named Earl Powell. Earl has worked with R. Kelly, and he's also worked with Jennifer Hudson. He produced a song called Don't Shoot. And the 3 young kids that are 11, 12, and 13, I believe. It's an incredible song, but he can't get it played. He can't get one radio station or one TV station to play the song. And it's an incredible, incredible song by 3 incredibly talented young kids, but he can't get it on.
Well, who makes the decisions at the radio stations, especially those who claim to be black-owned or black-managed?
Most of them are controlled by, one group. So very few of the record companies or record, what are called the program directors, have the right to really make choices about what is played on the radio stations. This all coming down from their corporate offices. But part of the problem with that is that we're in a position where we say to ourselves, well, they make those decisions because that's what people want. And at some point, we were convinced that we are outside of ourselves. So there are black people that will say, well, black people don't want to hear that. And if we say that black people don't want to hear that, but we want to hear it, it means that we are not seeing ourselves as being black.
Mm-hmm.
So we're saying that everybody else is different than us.
Mm-hmm.
But if at some point we were to look at ourselves and say, well, there are some other people like me. I'm not that special.
Mm-hmm.
There are some other black folks that want to hear some positive stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
There's some other black folks that want to go to see movies that are not degrading.
Mm-hmm.
There's some other black people that want to look at art that is representing us in a positive way. So we collectively have to say that, no, this is enough. We are not going to allow you to tell us that this is what we want to see, and then we're going to go out and pay money to see it. We have to stop. We have to stop.
I'm just trying to figure out how it is that we are entertained by films that demean us. I have just seen a plethora of films that demean us. In one film, the black man was the bad guy. He was the guy who was trying to molest the young girl. He was the guy who was cheating on his wife and abusing the other woman. The Latino character was the good guy who had to protect these people from the bad guy. The females were sorry. They are sorrowful females, one of whom was so self-absorbed that she didn't care that her mother was killing herself trying to take care of her sister's children, who was an unseen drug addict. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have dysfunction. I'm not saying that those things do not happen. But what I am saying is that we need to look at other things that happen far more often, such as families such as your own. You know, you lived in public housing, you grew up, you have become a filmmaker, a producer, director. You have been married to your wife, what?
34 years.
34 years. You have children that you have raised, and so forth and so on. What about some families, the majority of black families, what about some families who do not have all of this dysfunction blended into one family in a film that we could all flock to and be happy to support the maker of that film?
Well, one of the things is that we have to recognize that we have an obligation to have a conscience, and we have an obligation to be the keeper of our culture and history. As filmmakers, we have an obligation to look at what we do and understand that everything that you put out there makes a difference. So, if I'm doing a movie and I'm going to cast the villain, and I say that I'm going to cast the villain as a very, very dark person, and I'm going to cast the hero as a very, very light person, that makes a statement. Whether we accept it or not, it does. If I'm going to create a family and there's going to be a predator in the family, and I'm going to, in this family's house, put all African symbols, what am I trying to say? Because it makes a difference. I didn't decide I was going to put Christian symbols up. I decided as a writer that I'm going to subliminally attack African culture, whether we accept it or not. There is a need for us to stop apologizing for what we are. And Chris Rock recently did this piece called Good Hair. You cannot have a conversation about good hair without the audacity to have a conversation about our Africanness. You can't have a conversation about good hair without looking at what the destruction of black people and what a hair and the effect of hair has really done, and cavalierly say it's just about, you know, the fact that my daughters were saying that they wanted, you know, to look like some white kid, but you're not going to really deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
We're still apologizing.
Mm-hmm.
We're still apologizing for what we think other people need to hear for us to be accepted. We at some point have to stop apologizing for ourselves. And I'm not talking about this from a perspective of being angry, because I'm not really angry. You know, I'm not an angry militant in the sense of what people would consider. You know, I'm realistically looking at our history and saying, if we don't make a conscious effort to correct the images of ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
then who has the obligation and responsibility to do that?
Mm-hmm.
And if we can't criticize ourselves, then who will? If I'm going to create a movie and I'm going to make the hero a Hispanic guy in the midst of the black community, what message am I trying to send?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm sending one.
That's a
and
that's
as long as you
Tarzan
recognize it.
movie.
Well, yeah, but if you acknowledge it, if you say, I'm trying to do this because this is the message I'm trying to send,
Mm-hmm.
then I have a great deal of respect for you, because you have said, okay, I'm trying to get this message out that it's okay for us to have Hispanics in our community and to marry them and to be socially obligated to them, helping us to correct our ills. If you say that and that's what you want to do, say, okay, at least you understand what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't admit to the fact that that's what is being done, then what are you doing? Someone said the other day, I got an email, and they said that Monique should get an Academy Award for Precious because she's so wonderful in the movie. And I believe she is. But my response to them was, how many negative white characters have won Academy Awards as the best actor? I want you to go back and look at the list and see how many villains how many white villains have received Academy Awards for Best Actor. Just take a look at it, and you won't find that many. But when you look at black characters that have won Academy Awards, look at how
Training Day for Denzel, all the work that he did.
he should have won for Malcolm.
Absolutely. But he
won for
got
Malcolm.
the award for Training Day,
Most certainly.
for being a villain.
Most certainly. The worst of the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember doing a play years ago, and it was called The Mighty Gents. It was a gang. It was a play about street gangs that I directed, and I did a great job of directing it. But all of the lead gang members received Jeff Awards from the Chicago Jeff Society, and I remember thinking, when they received the awards, that the committee must have looked at that and said, "This is exactly what I expect black people to act like."
Mm-hmm.
And so, because they're so real at what I expected them to be, I'm going to award that performance,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what I expect from them.
Mm-hmm.
We just have to do better. And Stateway was great for me because it gave me an opportunity to look at the world from the top of it and not be restricted to it. Because I saw so many positive people there. I saw the negative side. I saw when men stopped being around. I saw the influx of the gangs. I saw the deterioration when people stopped caring and the city stopped putting money into it. And I even read the rat experiment. There was an experiment that was done in Germany where they took a series of rats and they built what would be considered a housing project for rats.
Mm-hmm.
And the longer they were there, the more they began to eat each other,
Mm-hmm.
the more they began to demonstrate signs of homosexuality,
Mm-hmm.
the more that they began to eat each other and turn into cannibalism and so
The
forth.
impact of overcrowding.
Most certainly.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember reading this study when I worked for Chicago Housing Authorities in the early 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I ran across the study
Mm-hmm.
when I was down at the corporate office. And I said, wow, this is... So they knew.
Mm-hmm.
They knew what it was going to
They
become.
were calling those sinks.
Yeah,
Those areas, they were calling them sinks.
yeah.
Because there is a formula. You know, it is not, this isn't happenstance. It doesn't happen by accident. And when you consider the fact that you take colloquialisms, things that, you know, is common in our language, and you name a theatrical piece by this phrase that we identify with, you know, and then under that rubric, you run all of these negative images. And when you think about the movie I just described, it's an updated version of a Tarzan movie, always where you have to have someone from outside of the community come in and save the savages for themselves, from themselves. Save the savage, civilize the savages. Otherwise, the savages are going to cannibalize each other. And so it creates a certain level of expectation that behavioral aberrations are not as alarming. You know, when I'm older, much older than you, when I was young, for someone to come out of the closet was alarming, you know, and they had some horrific names for what they called people who, you know, preferred members of their own sex. They had a horrific name for people who so-called abused drugs. They called them dope fiends, so that you got an image of somebody who was, you know, a monster and not somebody who was hopelessly dependent. So that you developed an aversion to certain kinds of behavior because it was socially objectionable. It was not approved by your kinship group. They would be ashamed of you. You know, you would be ostracized and rejected if you displayed certain kinds of behavior. Now, we didn't have rites of passage where, you know, you had the female circumcision or the male circumcision and the things that we had when we were in our land. But we did have certain kinds of expectations that kind of guided what you could become, you know, what you were expected to become. And you know, everybody was in on it. You know, Teresa Griffin in the last segment said she was raised by a village. Well, we were a village, and the village did raise us. So I went to school in the 8th grade with lipstick on. I was sent straight to the bathroom to get it off. I went to school with a shirt on backwards, you know, some kind of new style. I was sent to the bathroom, turn it around. The teacher took it upon herself. So when you talk about our taking the responsibility, first of all, we've got to recognize that some behavior is alarming, because allowed to go to its logical conclusion, it will be absolutely intolerable.
Well, certainly. It requires our ability to be able to demonstrate to young people how they should perceive the world, what you should see when you look outside. Do you see the garbage? Do you see the grass? Do you see the flowers? You know, how do you perceive your world? What kind of world do we want to be? It has been said, you know, more often than not, that our role and responsibility is to leave the planet a better place than we found it.
That's Kumba.
Yeah, and if that is the case, then what kind of creative images are you creating, and what are you leaving for the world? If you're looking at everything that you produce going in a time capsule, and your great-great-grandchildren looking at it, do you still write that book? Do you still produce that song? Do you put yourself in that movie? Because the legacy of what you are is going to be demonstrated in history by what you leave. And so if we think about consciously what we're putting out, then we might have some restrictions on what we do. The second thing is we have to have the ability to have young men and women get a perspective of what manhood and womanhood is designed to be. They have to be in a position where they're seeing images that create the style for what they should become. And we have a responsibility to do that. So how do they decide? You know, we have a lot of conversations with our teens on what is commitment, what is relationships, you know, what does it mean to you? If you say that I'm committed to you, you know, at what point in your life are you obligated to do that? And so if you're 14, 15, why are you looking at something that is called committed? And one of the young people told us that, well, because of what we've seen with our mothers and fathers, we want to get practice in so we know what hurt is like. That is a deep statement coming from a young teenager, that they have to practice on being hurt. They have to have a relationship that puts them in a position so that they can suffer, so they know what pain is about. We have to teach in a different way. There was a time when artists were revered, that they were the ones that set the standard for what culture and civilizations were going to be. We have to get back to that, but unless the artist sees that that's their responsibility. You know, we keep saying, and the artists have been told that they have no moral obligation to anything, so they can demonstrate and do whatever they want to do. Because they don't...
Artistic freedom?
Artistic freedom. And artistic freedom is extremely dangerous. You know, you mentioned homosexuality. And it's almost like you can't do a show now without having a homosexual as part of the cast or the crew. You can't. I mean, if you look at almost everything on television. And I'm not even at this point judging it. I'm just stating a fact that there's certain behaviors that are being demonstrated in our music, in our songs, in our dance, and it's part of what is required. You know, people that are Christian, you think Christian rappers can get a deal that they can get played on the radio? No, they have to be gangster rappers. If you're not a gangster rapper, you're not legitimate. And that's not our people saying it. That's the record executives that are making those choices and those decisions. When you go to Hollywood and you take a script, you're going in front of young Caucasian boys and men and women, and you're setting up in front of them and you're trying to say, I want you to help me tell the story of African civilization. I want you to help me tell the story of, you know, one of the greatest stories of all time would be the story of Marcus Garvey, Haile Selassie. You think Hollywood wants to tell those stories for us? No, and they shouldn't be obligated to. We shouldn't even have to ask. Because if I'm sitting in a Hollywood studio and someone brings me the Shirley Temple story and they tell me that they want me to make this movie, I would say, yeah, great, I'll make it, but I want to tell it from the perspective of Bojangles. That would be what I
Mm-hmm.
would do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily racial.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's not racist, it's racial, but it's not necessarily racist. I'm just telling it from the perspective of what I want to see.
Mm-hmm.
And so we should be in a position where we're creating the kind of stories that we want to tell. We have that obligation. We have the obligation to fund it. We have the obligation to produce them. We have the obligation to write them. And we have the obligation as a people to be the vanguards to determine whether or not they're socially acceptable. We should be doing that. You know, we have to tell our own stories in a way that we wanted to get out. Our stories have not been told. We can go down the list. There's so many stories in the African American community that have not been told. There's so many people, so many great folks that you could tell stories about. You know, you think people are going to tell the Panther Party story the correct way that it should be told? You know, the policy. At what point the policy movie is going to be done, where
The
where
Theodore Rowe.
yeah, and the fact that the lottery was a black game that was
Right.
stolen and co-opted, and now they're making
Right.
millions of dollars off
Right.
of something that should be part of the fabric of creating an economic system for our communities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, every ethnic group has had a way to make money, and most of them started illegally,
Mm-hmm.
and then they turned it into legitimate businesses. Every ethnic group except the African Americans in this country. The Irish did, the Tangs did. And at the point where we could have taken policy, it was taken away and made into something for the general public that we don't benefit from.
And there was not much in the way of violence associated with that until the people from the outside saw the money that was changing hands in the community and decided to so-called muscle in.
Most certainly.
And then you started having these drive-by shootings
Most certainly.
where they just came and took it away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The chicken shacks, companies of paper companies, car dealerships, the Negro Leagues, a lot of that stuff was funded by policy money.
Mm-hmm.
Because we had a legitimate way of making money that didn't have anything to do with drugs.
And then I saw it in the line of, businesses, there was, and I don't know how many communities this was in, but I saw the forerunner of the company that now makes the so-called pork rinds. Black people would buy what they call skins. They put them in a very hot oven, which would cause them to bubble up and crisp. And there were people who stood on the corner and sold those in little brown paper bags and put hot sauce on them if you wanted it or not.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing you see, there's a truck rolling through the neighborhood, and this is in cellophane packages, and they are selling what we invented back to us. And then, of course, there were always the people who had blocks of ice and had the ice shavers and had the various bottles of different color flavoring, and you would get snowballs. Then the next thing you look around, here you are in one of the department stores or supermarkets, and there is this machine that does the same thing. And I happen to have known somebody who was in management of that company, and I'm thinking, we invented that, we originated that. And so because the strong suit for us is improvisation. We make a way out of no way, because that's what has the hand that we have been dealt since we've been on these shores. And so consequently, we would always find a way to create what was absent if we needed it to be present in our lives.
Most certainly, and that's what rap was. Rap was a consequence of the lack of music programs. So when they cut all the music programs out in the schools, people started, sampling and scratching and making their own music and making human beatboxes and creating a way for what was not being provided. So it was a brand new style based on lack of opportunity. So a lot of times we are creative beyond measure, but we have to keep those things within the community, within ourselves, and it's always a challenge to look at America, to look at the society, and not be deemed as not wanting to fit in. Because a lot of our sacrifices and the things that we sacrifice is based on the fact that we really want to be accepted. Or we socially think that we need to accept anything that will keep us from going back into slavery. And I think sometimes psychologically we're accepting the best of two evils. In some ways, we really just want to get by and not stir up the pot too much because we really think that people will reject us and turn us away. And it's tragic, but it's in some ways it's very, very true. Because I remember hearing Patti LaBelle once say that she didn't feel accepted until she received the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame award, I think is what it was. As revered as she was in our community, it was being accepted by another community that made her feel special.
When you use the term back into slavery, I want to explore that.
I think sometimes black people subliminally don't want to go back to the future. I mean, back to the future. We don't want to go back to the past. And so as a result of that, we accept whoever's the worst, the best of the two evils in politics. We accept things just so that's not bad enough. We don't want to go back that far. And so we'll almost accept anything. You know, we don't want to raise up. We don't want to criticize, because in criticizing, it makes us really recognize where we are in this country. A lot of our young people are lost, but they're lost because they have no way of really being honest. Nobody is really being honest. And every time a person gets a job, we lose a lot. Jackie Robinson got a job, but we lost an industry. We lost the Negro Leagues.
Mm-hmm.
And we had more black millionaires during the Negro Leagues baseball players than we've had, that we had after that.
Mm-hmm.
And we had owners, but we lost it because one person got a job. I hope that in Barack Obama getting a job, because that's what he did, he got a job, that we don't ignore the fact that we have a whole society that needs to raise up. We have a community that is still lost. And a lot of times I think when we look at success, we measure it in small steps rather than in a large movement of a massive number of people. And so we'll say, we've got Oprah and we've got Michael Jordan and, we've got Barack Obama.
And we have 34% unemployment among black males.
Yeah. And they all know that the day after President Obama was elected, their lives didn't change at all.
Mm-hmm.
We changed our ability to look at our opportunity to move forward and to succeed in certain jobs. But on a daily basis, can they still find a job? Are they still living in squalor? Are our communities still being ripped out from under us? Yeah, all those things are still happening. And so what do we say to young people? Will we still constantly wear a mask? We still constantly lie about the reality of our existence.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know if we face it, the consequence of that will be us being taken off of TV, us being taken out of our jobs, us being removed from the ability to speak.
Well, the only manner in which I would take an issue with that statement is that I have never looked at our lot as causation by anything, caused by anything that we did. And I just hold fast to the notion that we were on the continent and we were traveling here and going back at will and intermingling and even intermarrying with the indigenous people here. And we were not doing anything to anybody. So our being captured and transported and transformed into slaves was not caused by something that we did.
Well, I don't disagree with that.
Okay, and further, our lot, you know, if we look at the truth or if we do this or do that, the decisions that we make are not decisions that determine our destiny, because if they were, our destiny could be different. The decisions that are made about us are being made irregardless of what we are or are not doing. So we don't have to criticize nothing. We don't have to make waves. We don't have to do nothing to nobody. Somebody somewhere is working 24/7, dispossessing black people of their homes, of their sources of support, of their children, of their lives, having nothing to do with whether these people are worthy people, whether they have the classic line in Roots was when Kizzy forged her name on the note and got herself off the plantation, and it was discovered that she had learned to read and write, and her parents had served the master for all this time, and he told them he was going to sell Kizzy. And they said, "Massa, after we done served you all these years, it did not make one bit of difference to the master that they had served him all those years. He was going to sell their child as punishment for that infraction. So it doesn't matter that we have served all these years, not making waves, not looking at it, not doing anything, is not going to change the fact that if we don't take control, if we don't recognize, as Jesse said, nobody's going to save us but us, that our fate is going to continue to be determined by people who have not necessarily always shown that they have our best interests at heart.
No, I agree with that 100%. I think that the issue, part of the issue that I'm raising is the fact that we have the tendency not to share that information. That a lot of times our grandparents thought in protecting us that they would not tell us what our plight was.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even now, we don't really talk to our children about history. We don't really tell them what we came through and where we've come from. I mean, when you look at a lot of the young people now, they know very little about even the 60s, let alone time before that.
Right.
And I think sometimes it's because, for whatever reason, we felt that it was a way of protecting them. That
But
if we
the Holocaust is in the curriculum,
It
in
should-
the public
right.
school curriculum.
That's true.
But the Ma'afa is not in the public school curriculum. We don't get to hear about the number of captives whose bones are still on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean.
Right. That's true.
But that's
That is true.
because the people who experienced the Holocaust insist that not only must their children know it, but everybody's children must know it and feel sympathy for the suffering that they endured. But no one has to feel sympathy. People will tell you, oh, that was back in the day, that happened back then. No, that's still happening. And it will continue to happen unless you recognize the need to say never again as the people who experienced the Holocaust. Never again.
Most certainly. But that's why people don't, why it's difficult for us to do historical material as filmmakers, because even our people keep saying to us, we don't want to hear that old stuff. And I think that you're absolutely right, that you have to go back and you have to capture it and you have to document it so that it won't be replicated again. But at the same time, so you get a legitimate understanding of what we've been through so that you know the direction in which you're going. But too many times, I think we don't think it's important to tell those stories. The fact that young people don't know that all you needed to be free was a handwritten note and to get out of slavery, which basically meant that if you could read or write, you could write your past, like you said, from roots, and you could be free. Sometimes it was as simple as that. Now, of course, sometimes they didn't acknowledge the notes, and they tore them up, and they sent you back to slavery anyway. But a pass was a handwritten note. And a lot of times the Caucasian, I should say the Europeans during that period of time, they couldn't write that well anyway. They didn't speak English that well either. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes it was not even a very well constructed note that was being written. And so that's why it's extremely important that we learn how to read, that we value education, that we value learning. You know, too many times we hear teenagers say, I'm just glad that I'm not in school, that I don't have to study, and what is that not doing to you if it's not making you better with whatever it is that you're studying? If you understand the importance of improving your plight, and that your plight is improved by the amount of information that you have and what you're capable of doing, then learning needs to be an important part of what you do.
And furthermore, you need to see yourself as a part of something and not as an individual. That's really our downfall. Because I went back to school after dropping out of high school because I had a family, and it became clear to me that my husband simply could not take care of all these children by himself with his post office job, that I needed to work, and I did not know how to do anything. So that meant that I needed to go to school so that I could learn to do something that I could then be able to share in the support of my children. But that's because I saw myself as a part of a family. When you see yourself as an individual, you don't have to do anything for anybody else.
No, you're absolutely right. And this is one of the major problems of our time, that there's so many people that are single and they have to work, so the children are left alone. They're scurrying around trying to survive as single households. It's a hard place to be. It's a very, very, very difficult place to be.
Well, people say that our community is not organized, but it is organized. It's organized against itself. We organize into social clubs, into religious denominations, into political parties, into all kinds of things. But we're not organized into what they call the extended family, which is only the African family because everybody's in it. It's not extended. What do you mean extended? You had to sew something onto the end of this in order to extend it? No. So you're part of a family, which means that that family is a unit, and that unit has a head, and that unit has someone to whom you must be accountable, and someone for whom you must be accountable. And so you understand this, which means that somebody in that unit has the final say. Somebody can say the final no, and that's it, and that's the end of it. We have lost that. The authority of black parents to be able to say no to their children is severely undermined by this so-called democracy, in which children have a right to their opinions and they should be able to make decisions about how they live. The other part of it is you are your sisters, your brothers, your mothers, your children's keeper, which means that there should not ever be a child who is home alone, because the children can't be left unsupervised and unprotected. We have to take care of our children.
And that was one of the things that Stateway Gardens did for me anyway. We had the park. And the park was a place that we could go. There was supervision. There was a theater company there. There was, there was dance. There was ping pong. There was pool. There was supervision. But now it costs so much that it's difficult for children to even go. And they have no places to center themselves. There are very few institutions where they can find an opportunity to visit.
Well, before I lived in public housing, I lived in the part of the south side of Chicago called the Valley. And right up on what was then South Parkway, there was the Baptist Institute or something of that sort. It was probably run by a church. We didn't know whether it was or not, but it was a great big building, and it had a lot of rooms. And I went there and I took drama, I took dance, I took some kind of painting or art. You know, there were all these classes that you could go as soon as you got out of school. You could go there and you could do all these things. And then there were performances. So if you were in this class, you got to show yourself off doing this, or in that class, you got to show yourself off doing that. Now we have these mega churches. Okay, they got these huge congregations. Where is the social outreach? Where is the tithing back into the community so that the community can replace those things that are being removed from public institutions?
You know, that's a whole program where I think that a lot of these ministers in the larger churches should be sitting here to answer those questions. But when I was growing up, the Y was there, the Boys and Girls Clubs were there, the price was minuscule, so we could always go and we could attend, and those opportunities just no longer exist to the degree that they did. But that having been said, there are a number of us, there are a number of people in our communities that are still making positive strides, that are still doing things, that are offering programs that are being beneficial, or as beneficial as they can. Part of the problem is that there's no anchor for their stories to be told and celebrated. And that's why, you know, I pay homage to you on a show like this, because you give opportunity to voices that don't have the opportunity to be heard.
Well, you know, people give me cues and tell me when the time is up, because I get so engrossed in interviews like yours and mine is now, that I just don't know that I want to stop. But I do want you to say that you have a movie that will be coming out.
Yes, we have a film of Boys and Men, which is starring Angela Bassett and Robert Townsend, that will be in theaters soon. And we also have a short film, Burning Truth, that we produced last year that deals with HIV and AIDS among teens. And we have a new documentary that will be out soon, which is entitled 19 and a Day, that we're currently shooting. And our next project is a documentary that deals with the foundation and beginning of the Creole Society in New Orleans that we hope
And
to
who
shoot by
is
the
the
summer.
we?
My wife, Masekwa, and I.
Okay.
And Masekwa Myers and Associates. We've worked together for a number of years, and I always have to pay homage to her.
And I have to pay homage to you, Pemon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming.